Soon you'll be able to earn virtual currency and virtual reality. If you take the number of hours that you spend looking at a screen, a good chunk of that, maybe all of that, gets replaced with a VR helmet, which means that for a good chunk of people in the world, the majority of their waking hours are going to be spent in the Matrix.
The Silicon Valley entrepreneur Balaji Srinivasan is a modern-day polymath who venture capitalist Mark Andreessen has called the person with the highest output per minute of new ideas of anybody I've ever met in my life. A PhD in electrical engineering, a co-founder of a genetic testing firm, and a Stanford computer science lecturer, Srinivasan was also on Donald Trump's shortlist to head up the Food and Drug Administration. Today he spends most of his time as CEO of the cryptocurrency startup Earn.com. Srinivasan believes in the power of technology to provide a way for individuals to migrate away from ossified institutions or destructive policies. Borrowing from the classic book by Albert O. Hirschman, he refers to this path as exit.
While we talk a lot about voice in the context of the U.S. and talk about democracy, that's very important, but we're not just a nation of immigrants, we're a nation of immigrants. We're shaped by both voice and exit. A voice gains much more attention when people are leaving in droves.
One of the things I think a lot about is if you've got an existing system and it's ossified, there's kind of at least two responses to it. There's more than two, but at least two. One is, voice, which in its extremist is revolution. Revolution is extreme voice where, it's saying, oh, I'm so dissatisfied, let's take the whole thing over, right? And then democracy is, like a much more limited version of that, but still also effective in many cases. You can actually vote to go and change things. Alternatively, if you believe that, it's going to be too hard to change things that way, but you're also cognizant of the fact that certain people like it that way, there's an alternative you can pursue, which is exit, right? You say, okay, I'm not going to be able to change the system. I recognize why you guys have it the way it is, but it doesn't suit my preferences, so I'm going to leave and start something new. All progress is really the process of you exit, you build something up, and then it gets ossified, and the next generation exits again. For example, a startup starts, and what happens is the libertarian founder ends up rebuilding the state. That is to say, you start as like an individual, and often people do that because they want to have total autonomy and control. And then what they find is, as they get to a certain scale, well, they sort of need to have some policies. They need to have something in place so that you don't have like 500 autonomous people just moving in their own direction, but you have 500 people working as a team.
A startup gets big enough, and then you got to bring in an HR
exactly.
person. Then you got to start saying, oh, no, you got to wear shoes in the office. You got to do this. You got to do
all that type of stuff. Exactly. And so as you transition from like burn rate to bus number is how many people can get hit by a bus for this thing to continue enduring. Once your bus number has to be bigger than one for every position, you start to actually have to view people as replaceable. Because if they're not replaceable, you haven't done your job right as kind of, the founder. And that's a critical transition that happens in companies where they transition from a collection of individuals to a multicellular organism. Now, what happens then is if that goes too far, you get initiative being kind of constrained, you get bureaucracy, you get all these kinds of things that potentially in the long term are to the detriment of that multicellular organism, and they cause people to leave. And that's exit, and then you start a new thing.
Srinivasan sees his current venture, Earn.com, as a tool that ultimately could provide workers exit. The company allows individuals to get paid for accomplishing small tasks like completing surveys and answering emails.
What if we could kind of exit the current system of how folks try to employ others and get jobs and so on, and actually have like a completely frictionless digital workforce, right? Where you could hire anyone from anywhere, and if they had the merit, they could do the job. Now, there's all kinds of national boundary issues, compliance issues, regulatory issues, et cetera. But as an ideal, what if you start with something which pays you to reply to emails, but then in 5 or 10 years, you open up Earn.com anywhere, and you've just got a feed of tasks, and that's your job. Sort of actually like Marx talked about even, in the Communist Manifesto, he talked about, hey, wouldn't it be awesome if you could be a hunter in the morning and a tailor at night and switch through all these different professions? What if you could actually do that in such a way that didn't involve killing millions of people like communism did, right? What if you could just actually, flip through these tasks, look at all the ones you're qualified for, do this, this, and this. Guess what? You made $100 for that day.
And
right?
it's an interesting twist on exit because, the Pilgrims left, or the Puritans left England, moved to America to try something.
Right.
Here, you can stay in Nigeria.
You can exit in place.
We're living in multiple communities and multiple orders at any given point in time.
That's exactly right. And I think that's what technology is doing is it's reducing the barrier to exit. And there's two dimensions on which that is true. The first is a dimension that you just remark about, which let's call that the cloud dimension, right? Because the cloud, you can earn from anywhere, you can collaborate from anywhere, and soon you'll be able to join like a VR world and earn virtual currency and virtual reality, right? And
finally realize that you hate you hate your coworkers in the cloud just as much as you do in the office.
Maybe. Yeah, exactly. But if so, then
it's utopian.
Right. So you can hit the back button and just warp into another virtual reality, right? So I think that particular combination, by the way, VR with virtual currency, is going to be a huge, huge thing. We haven't yet hit, the next dog leg up in VR. There's something missing. There's probably going to be an iPhone of VR kind of moment. Something is not yet being, out there in the market. But when that thing actually hits, you're going to see something very interesting, which is if you take the number of hours that you spend looking at a screen, right? For many people, many of the folks, who are information workers, that's the majority of waking hours of your day, especially if you add up the, amount looking at your phone and your tablet and what have you, right? So a good chunk of that, maybe all of that, gets replaced with a VR helmet, which means that for a good chunk of people in the world, the majority of their waking hours are going to be spent in the Matrix. You're going to be earning in the Matrix. And you're going to be earning with coworkers who are from Brazil and Japan and all this other stuff. And so machine translation becomes extremely important, right? Real-time machine translation. Digital currency becomes extremely important because you need to be able to transact across borders. And where people are being organized is by their interest, not necessarily by their geography, right? So let's call that the cloud axis, where you can kind of just put on your VR headset, jack in, and you'll be part of whatever kind of group around the world you want. The two senses that are missing are taste and smell, but you'll be able to get sight and sound, and then with haptics and kind of omnidirectional treadmills, you can get touch. So haptics, people probably know about, your hands will vibrate and so on. Omnidirectional treadmills are kind of what they sound like, where you don't just walk in one direction, but you can walk in 360 degrees. Being developed for games now, they give a much more immersive experience. It's a combination of those three. You can do most things other than, touch and taste and smell. The second major axis is mobile. Mobile is making us more mobile. Your geography becomes less important. By that, what I mean is, there's a logic that is held really since the Treaty of Westphalia, which is that implicitly your neighbors share your values, and your physical neighbors and you roughly agree on what the law is for that jurisdiction, right? Increasingly, what's happening is, you live in an apartment complex and you wouldn't even recognize your neighbors, but you have long conversations with somebody 1,000 miles away, right? There's a one-liner which says, Snapchat is on the straight line with the dissolution of the nation state, because you're sharing intimate moments with people who are hundreds or thousands of miles away, and you don't know your next door neighbor.
Srinivasan says Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies are another key technology in creating a borderless world because they make it possible to transfer value anywhere without relying on a trusted intermediary.
With Earn.com, if you're sending a message to 1,000 people in 100 different countries, and you want to pay them about $10 to reply to an email or fill out a survey, that'd be the kind of thing where wire transfer fees would kill you if you're using Swift to do that. And it would just be a huge hassle to try to automate all those wires. Plus, it'd be hard to get people on the other side to set up bank account integration for just relatively small amounts of payment. So for all of those reasons together, it becomes something where paying people small amounts of money across borders quickly and settling it is the kind of thing that cryptocurrency is very good for and the blockchain is very good for that was not possible in the previous world.
So what do I mean by Silicon Valley's ultimate exit? It basically means build an opt-in society run by technology. Drones, warfare is going to become software, laws are going to become code, management via robotics is going to become automation, and property rights are going to become a network effect.
In that 2013 talk, you discussed how Silicon Valley, which is a physical place,
Yep.
But it's separating from other great cities, Boston as like the ultimate education city, New York as the ultimate commercial, DC as the ultimate legal or giver of laws, LA in entertainment. Silicon Valley was separating from that in various ways. But is there something about space? So, Silicon Valley in many ways is the outgrowth of Stanford and Berkeley and a couple of other universities, plus one or two companies going back to the 50s, whether it's Fairchild Semiconductor or whatever. I mean, that, where you can kind of create a family tree. Would that kind of stuff happen if these people were not meeting in close proximity? And can you replace that in virtual space?
Yeah, so that's a very important question. And I think, though, that there's a bunch of factors that are going to lead to decentralization of technology out of Silicon Valley. There's the cost of real estate, just the fact that immigration to the US is becoming more challenging in many different ways. The home countries are getting better now, right? Like, India's really not that bad, to live anymore. And every year remote work technology becomes better and better, right? You get Slack, you get, like better mobile hangouts and video, and all those things kind of keep improving. And companies that are just starting out, they have something very interesting, which is they have the ability to go and negotiate with cities and negotiate with countries. So, for example, let's say you're a country that's got a sovereign fund, you want to attract technology to your locale. You say, guess what? we're not going to regulate cryptocurrency for the next 10 years. Blockchain regulation moratorium. Come on in, the water's warm. We'll also take a 5% stake in your company through our sovereign fund, right? So I think you're going to see a lot more stuff like that.
Does that bother you as a form of crony capitalism that might really screw up markets?
So no, it doesn't. And the reason is because, so first, disclosure. Like, it's something where it's going to be done in a very above board way. These are reputable sovereign funds and whatnot. Second, there's competition because, if Dubai wants to get in the bidding, if Israel wants to get in the bidding, if Estonia does, I'm sure that company would be interested in the thing. Third is there should, if everything goes well, be a significant benefit to the locale, because guess what? They've got the next Detroit or the next Wall Street or whatever there because they adopted self-driving cars or they adopted cryptocurrency and blockchain earlier. So, whereas crony capitalism is usually like more of like a bribe or a payoff that's done non-transparently, that's done without a competitive process, and that doesn't actually benefit the population.
So do you think the locale, and I guess part of it depends on the final price tag, but we have seen, just a grotesque outpouring of honest graft, public graft from cities saying, Amazon, put your headquarters here and we'll give you $5 billion. We'll stop. We won't charge you any taxes. We'll build the infrastructure. We'll do this. Dallas says they're going to build a high-speed rail stop, at the Amazon HQ. If it comes to Dallas, where the train would go from there, who knows? I mean, is there any way that that's actually good for capitalism or good for markets?
Well, so first it's a refreshing change from the opposite, which is if you have a jurisdiction that takes a large entity like Amazon for granted, they can just pile on the taxes, pile on the regulations, and eventually they, whether they kill the golden goose or they just stop it from building in that region is one thing, right? So this is a refreshing change in the other direction, frankly. With that said, there's principal agent issues, right? Where, for example, that HS high-speed rail thing or what have you, maybe it's something where the mayor or the governor is effectively spending money out of their own, not out of their own pocket, but out of their constituents' pockets for something that's, not actually that beneficial. I think what happens is over time you get a market process that lands you somewhere in the middle. If they don't act in your interest, well, you as a citizen also have the ability to move because taxes got too high in your region.
You used to, particularly on your Twitter account, which has kind of gone missing lately or silent, but you used to cite the 1997 book, The Sovereign Individual, a lot. What is that book and how does that inform your worldview?
So awesome book. And it's also Peter Thiel's one of his favorites. He's talked about that. Other folks like it a lot in Silicon Valley. The thing about that book is it's kind of like, it's like the book of prophecies. And what I mean by that is it was written in 1999 and you open it and you read through it and many of the sentences seem like they were ripped from last week's headlines, right? And some of them have yet to happen. And so what's remarkable about this is that typically when you take a nonfiction book, like say, like a Malcolm Gladwell book or something like that, you can often summarize 400 pages in a sentence. Whereas The Sovereign Individual is the opposite, where I could take a sentence in it, I could expand that into its own book. So in a nutshell, what the thesis is that there's different ages of history. And, during these different ages, the relationship between property and violence has changed. Now we're transitioning into a new era where, the network and the nature of property with respect to digital currency and other kinds of things related to the blockchain is something where no amount of violence can solve a math problem. And so what that means is if you just know somebody's...
I wish you had told that to my nun math teachers.
Sure. They could apply it to you.
Yes.
It might not make you
It did not solve many problems.
Right. But the thing about that is you might see $100 million in the Bitcoin blockchain, but first you need to identify that person who has that, which is non-trivial in its own right. And then second, you would have to figure out how to get that private key from that person, which again is not that easy to do. It's not like, the wire transfer system where you can just hit a button and just garnish the wages or debit the account. That's a very new thing. What that does, it shifts the logic of violence, where it used to be that if you had, the biggest military, you could always take the most money, but that's not going to necessarily be the case as things move forward. And so what the Sovereign Individual is about is tracing that thesis through in much more detail than we're currently talking about. And saying, okay, what happens when you can't just see somebody's money, right? Now, there's good things that happen, which is that, everything becomes voluntary. And, if you're a wealth creator, you can keep the wealth that you create. There's bad things that happen, which is that if robberies happen, if criminals happen, it's harder to follow the money, cut off their flow of funds. And so one of the things that the guy predicts is you're both going to have more upside and more downside, right? You're going to have like these incredible cities and organizations that push the frontiers, and you're going to have lots more petty crime. But one thing you're probably also going to have a lot less of are massive wars. There might be like one big transitional war as you kind of go into the new era, but after that point, because you can't just seize funds, it becomes harder for governments to just seize funds for their military to start wars. So on net, I think it's actually a very positive thesis for kind of humanity, but there's going to be some rocky transitional moments between now and then.
Srinivasan actually began his career as an entrepreneur with a healthcare startup. While he was teaching at Stanford a decade ago, he and his older brother Ramji founded the genetic testing firm Counsel, which aims to improve the way genetic diseases are identified and treated. What are the most popular services that Counsel offers to people?
We've got several different genetic testing services, but the first and kind of the flagship product is a test for every major Mendelian genetic disease. And one way of thinking about this is, prior to Counsel, it was common for doctors to go and sort of imprecisely bucket people by ethnicity. Okay, so this couple is African American, this couple is Jewish American, this couple is Southeast Asian, and so on. And then they would say, okay, this group is at risk for sickle cell anemia, and this group is at risk for Tay-Sachs, and this group for beta thalassemia and whatnot, right? But for many different reasons, first is that ethnic bucketing is imprecise, right? For example, Obama is at risk for both sickle cell anemia and cystic fibrosis because he's in at least 2 ethnic groups. And second, it's not just imprecise. It will mean that you don't catch every risk allele, right? And there's African Americans who have cystic fibrosis genes and vice versa. And third is it's also something which is error prone because you sometimes don't test somebody for something that they should have been tested for. So instead, what we were able to do is take all of these Mendelian genetic diseases and test for them in one assay, which is actually cheaper than the blood-based assays that used to happen with this new kind of genomic test. And before, you'd have to basically do these individual tests for each one, and now you can just one unified test.
What do people do if they both realize they're, the husband and wife or whatever are Tay-Sachs carriers, then they choose not to have kids, or do they do IVF and do selective embryos and things like that?
Yeah, so they've got several different options. So the earlier you know, the more options you have, right? So Doria Sharim, for example, actually does this kind of testing even before marriage, so that a couple can choose whether to get married or not, right? That's a couple that's an organization that does Jewish genetic testing and matchmaking together. If you know after marriage but before conception, then yes, you can do in vitro fertilization plus a procedure called pre-implantation genetic diagnosis, where you take a plate of embryos that have been fertilized, you diagnose them prior to implanting into the mother's womb, and you find the one that does not have the genetic disease.
As gene editing technologies advance and costs plummet, some bioethicists have expressed concern that in the future, parents will abort children with genetic diseases or create so-called designer babies whose genes are altered to improve their intelligence or physical appearance. The state of Ohio just banned recently at the end of 2017, and I don't know exactly how they're going to enforce this or whatever, but they banned abortion based on amniocentesis, or a sonogram that showed that a fetus has Down syndrome. How do you feel about that kind of intervention?
Well, so first is the IVF PGD thing that I talked about is not abortion.
Right.
And so the advantage of that is it's something that, both increases reproductive choice. So it's something that the left can get behind, and it reduces the number of terminations because prior to, when the child has a thing. So that's something the right can get behind. So in general, we try to look for those kind of win-win things. With something like the Ohio matter, it's very hard to get inside a woman's head and try to restrict her autonomy on something like that. Certainly, I'm not in favor of a law like that. But I think that it's also something that's very difficult to enforce because you could probably just drive across the border.
So again, to bring it back to exit, this is the type of thing where the law, a state, big or small, tries to maintain a certain code, a law, and people can exit that system relatively easily.
Right. Yeah, that's right. And I think...
and I guess what your technology would do at Counsel is that it helps, not always and not perfectly, but it helps you really minimize the chances you're going to be in a situation where something like that would be it.
That's right. Because basically by knowing prior to the pregnancy, that's when you have both more reproductive choice and you have fewer terminations. So you don't actually have to have that trade-off, like if you know prior to it, right? And that's generally a Silicon Valley thing, is the more information you can get earlier, the more educated and informed decision you can make.
You talked with President Trump about being the head of the FDA. Based on your experience with Counsel, What was that like? What was he like? And what would you have done if you had actually become the head of the FDA?
I think that the current head of the FDA is actually doing some good things. I like what Scott has been doing on the legalization of DTC genomics, and he has reduced the barriers to entry for medical apps and stuff like that. I think that there are areas like CRISPR, for example, where the United States is potentially in danger of falling behind. And
CRISPR is relatively easy gene editing.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. So very fundamental technology, which is just being pursued aggressively, for example, in China. There's a Wall Street Journal article on this the other day, but it's common knowledge to the people who are in the field. And so there's areas where, it just may be something where, computer innovation happened in the United States, but many kinds of biotech innovation may just have to be done outside the United States.
And is that because, we'll try to say it as politely as possible, and I'm not sure that it will be, but it's just that in certain countries, either the government is in charge and they can kind of force a level of experimentation we're uncomfortable with, or they don't have the same kind of moral hang-ups, that we might have in the United States.
I think it's a little different than that. It's not, because this is not the 1970s China where it's like, forced abortions and so on. This is much more of a free market. I'm not saying.
I'm thinking also even of South Korea has clearly been doing a lot of stuff that would not even be tried in the United States.
Right. So I think a different way of thinking about it is that these are still, civilizations, countries that feel like they're on the rise. And, when America was kind of confident like that, there were plenty of folks who were volunteer test pilots. Planes didn't just start to fly themselves. There were guys who took very substantial risks as being the first people to pilot an experimental aircraft, and a bunch of people died. If you go to the history of automobiles or aviation or railroads, a lot of people died. If you look at the history of chemistry, there was, the CRC Handbook of Chemistry and Physics prior to, kind of the modern era has lots of tastes and smells for compounds because people used to just taste and smell new compounds, right? And I'm sure there was some guy who, sniffed some cyanide and the last thing he wrote down was almonds, and he collapsed and he took one for the team basically and kind of advanced science, right? And so, the way that I sort of think about it is if euthanasia is legal, right? If you can choose to end one's own life, if it's legal to go and bungee jump and skydive, if it's legal to go and fight in a war and potentially die for a futile reason, well, then it should be legal to take an informed risk for a treatment that could help you, right? Essentially, your body, your choice, right? I would try to have the United States be competitive with the rest of the world. And one way that you could do that is actually try to keep most, or really all of the existing FDA intact, but look to what the FAA and some other regulatory agencies are doing. So for example, the FAA has these drone zones that have been opened in various areas, which are meant to, in lightly populated areas, allow the flying of drones with less regulation, right? There's also these so-called fintech regulatory sandboxes where you can have startup companies with less regulatory overhead than they would have, if they had to comply with the full panoply of laws. And you've got things like
it's almost like charter schools where you give like a space for innovation and experimentation.
Loaded term. So, but I'd call it a special innovation zone, by analogy to a special economic zone. Relatively few people know how big a deal special economic zones are, but outside the United States, they were like the primary engine of growth for China and for other countries. And if we did something like that here, where we already got a precedent for it with the drone zones and the self-driving car zones and so on, we might be able to have a zone, let's say, the Mayo Clinic was overseeing it, where it was willing doctor, willing patient.
Who are your intellectual and business heroes? And how do you identify yourself kind of ideologically, or, what do you call yourself?
I'd say pragmatist, technologist. And I, for the most part, try to decline any kind of political or ideological label outside of those. For many reasons. One is that, I do believe in the ability of technology to improve the world. And I would like to have the largest possible coalition behind something like that. And I think that ideological and political labels tend to repel more than they tend to attract. Whereas a new technology, you don't need to be a Republican or Democrat to, buy cryptocurrency or, use ride sharing or stay in an Airbnb. And in fact, many of the earliest adopters are Democrats, actually, at least nominally. So, it wouldn't be, even if it's like arguably like, like anti-regulation or what have you.
There was various moments in the 2016 campaign where Bernie Sanders and Hillary Clinton, both of whom talked down the sharing economy or the gig economy, but they almost exclusively took Uber or ride-sharing companies to campaign events.
The ideal is to get something which is so useful as a technology that even people who might disagree with certain aspects of it ideologically, nevertheless it improves their lives, right? And so at least the way I try to identify is I'm a technologist who wants to build things that improve people's lives. I think I was able to do that with my first company. Hopefully we can do that with this and other ventures.
Well, I mean, you have a PhD in electrical engineering.
Yes.
Yeah, so who are the egghead heroes of your life? Who are the technologists that you look up to?
Srinivasan Ramanujan, India's greatest mathematician. He's got kind of a romantic story in India because he's sort of the combination of the Einstein there, like smart guy, but also a rags to quote riches story. Even though he didn't get rich, he was truly destitute in India and was able through pure genius to actually become a mathematician at Cambridge and publish a number of papers. And he died in a young way, very romantically. And he's somebody who motivates me because one of the things I'd like to do at some point in the future is have like a worldwide talent search for all these kids around the world in South America, Nigeria, in the Middle East, and Eastern Europe, and India, and China, who, for a reason, the 20th century missed out on them or missed out on their parents, and so now they could actually, with the internet, have the opportunity to rise. So that's one person who I think about a lot. Second person, Lee Kuan Yew. So not necessarily a scientist per se, but definitely
this is the father of Singapore.
Father of Singapore. That's right. A pragmatist who, if you read his, he's written a lot. He gave a bunch of interviews. He had a great book, Third World to First. And that's literally what he did. He took a country that was, really had no natural resources or any advantages. It was a swampy kind of land. It was a post-colonial society. It was riven by language. It had all these different, ethnic groups there that weren't necessarily all that friendly. And he turned it into, one of the wealthiest countries in the world. And so the choices he made there, I think, are really interesting to look at, because Lee Kuan Yew you would not describe as easily pigeonholed as libertarian or conservative or socialist or
he actually mixes from a lot, because he was definitely for economic freedom, also kind of authoritarian, but also kind of socialistic in the level of government services that are provided by Singapore.
Right. Like Singapore's HSA is simultaneously both to the right and to the left of the United States. So, the HSA there, the way it works is you are forced to save in a separate savings account, which is to the left of the US, because it's not just a tax, it's like a forced savings account. But then you can spend in a completely free market way from that forced savings account. So that's like to the right of the American system, because it's no insurance or it doesn't work in the same way. So it's just something which is sort of outside the bounds. And that's something I think about a lot in the context of startups, for example, because, startups have like a combination of both right and left aspects, right? Or classically right and left aspects. They have, some degree of hierarchy. They have capitalism. They have funding and runway and profit, all those kinds of metrics, obviously, which are typically right of center metrics. But they work in large part because they're egalitarian, they're mission driven, they have informal attire, they have a screw the man attitude, and the best ones actually genuinely perpetuate or accomplish a revolution, right? And that's definitely not a right of center thing. That's not respect the existing hierarchy, et cetera.
Do you think, as effectively you're living your entire life in the 21st century, are these we need new categories, probably.
Yeah, I think so. I'll give an example, which I think is interesting. So, when Google initially introduced free lunches, this is not like a long time ago, like 15 years ago, it was for many, what I call right of center CFO type bean counters. This was looked at as this really dumb, liberal hippie thing they were doing, but it actually turned out to be something that was better by both metrics, because it gave both more community feeling within the organization. Everybody had like something in common. They could all go to lunch, right? And it was in a sense a seizure from their paycheck, right? So rather than giving everybody the right libertarian thing would be give everybody an extra $1,000 and their utility will be increased. That was not what actually happened.
You give them a $1 hamburger and they love you like you're the greatest thing in the world.
Well, I'm not saying it might even be more expensive, right? So not necessarily cheaper per se, but it is something where there was a solution that was not the classically, like dollars and cents individual solution that did optimize community feeling. And so I think a lot about stuff like that, where ultimately you're looking for a pragmatic best outcome and not something that just has to be right or left.
As a final question, your father in India grew up in a house or a hut with dirt floors. You grew up in Long Island, which is, a mild improvement.
Sure.
You have a 1-year-old child who now is growing up in the Bay Area in San Francisco.
Yep.
Very successful set of parents. What are the things that need to, what kind of world do you think your son will grow up in, and what are the one or two things that will either make it much better than it is today already, or will like plunge us backwards in time?
That's a good question. I mean, I think this transitional era that we're going through now, I think is going to be something where there's both nationalist and socialist responses to this kind of emerging cloud economy that are often going to be, very negative. So one thing I think a lot about with my son actually is I probably want him to go Satoshi. And by that, what I mean is, Satoshi Nakamoto is the world's first pseudonymous billionaire, but he won't be the last, right? And one of the great things about Satoshi is, you couldn't discriminate against him, both positively or negatively, right? If he's Bill Gates' son or daughter, you wouldn't know that. But you also wouldn't know if he was from some disfavored, group or whatever in whatever country. He just competes completely on the basis of ideas. I'd want to start him at like kind of that equality of opportunity level. And then he knows whatever he achieves is kind of on him. In terms of the kinds of things I would look out for, I think it's going to be pretty good, the transitional kind of thing. I actually think that, I believe in the Steven Pinker thesis for the most part that, violence is decreasing. We're aware of it more because, there's the 24/7 news coverage, but it is something where on net it's getting better. And especially if, the long-term consequence of cryptocurrency and the blockchain and so on is to limit the ability of states to wage wars. Maybe there's one big one coming up that would be unfortunate. Assuming he survives through that, I think it'll be pretty good.
So one of the most creative people here, he is the founder of Council, which is a very successful genomics company. He went on to become a board partner at Andreessen Horowitz, and he is also the CEO of 21Co, a Bitcoin company that he is going to tell you about. So without further ado, I would like to introduce you to Balaji.
All right. Okay. Can everyone hear me? Oh, okay. Just using this mic? Great. Okay. So I've got a very practical talk, I think, here, where if you listen to it, by the end of it, you will, be on the path to being personally richer, maybe, and getting some digital currency. So just to motivate this, kind of what I want to talk about is how we can enable discussion of truly new ideas. And I think there's two ways that you can do that. There's an individual solution, which is to maximize your personal runway, and a more collective solution, which is to help build a parallel economy. But let me motivate this because it's kind of right out there. Michael gave you my background, very briefly. I taught CS and stats at Stanford, founded a genomics company, et cetera. Our current vehicle is at 21.co, so you can go there and check that out. But let me just dive into today's talk. So the problem I want to talk about is that today, increasingly, not just in the US, but worldwide, speaking your mind may mean losing your job. And this is a big problem for people who want to explore new ideas, like, for example, the concept behind 1517 Fund, or other things that are like that. The more innovative and new your thing is, by definition, if it's innovative and new, it's not yet popular, so it's unpopular, and unpopular things can sometimes get you fired. And so there's at least two ways that one can buffer against this. There's the individual solution, which is basically become wealthy enough that you essentially have FU money, and then you can just say, hey, who cares? And I've actually got a deterministic path to getting there, which I'll get to. The other solution is actually to build a parallel economy where you separate your earning name from your speaking name from your real name. And if those are disaggregated, there's this saying that in computer science, the answer to every problem is another layer of indirection. Then if your earning name and your speaking name and your real name are all different things, then you can speak under this name, and if somebody attacks you, it doesn't matter because your earning is uninterrupted and the real person walks unscathed. So I'll get to that as well. Let's first talk about that first part. Let's motivate this, right? So there's this guy, Yakov Smirnov. He does all of these, jokes. They're better in his accent. But one of the jokes goes like this, right? In Soviet Russia, we too have freedom of speech, but in America, you have freedom after speech, right? Now, this is a funny joke, but increasingly an unfunny joke is that, there's less operative and practical freedom of speech in the United States nowadays because, social media, especially Twitter, is just a war zone, and people are just yelling at each other all the time. And, there have been articles on this, but people here are probably familiar with the concept that Twitter mobs are just now routine. You can lose your job for saying something dumb, or even if someone close to you says something dumb, it's no longer limited to journalists versus public figures. Now, everyone's a journalist and everyone's a public figure. A concrete example of this just happened a few days ago is there's a woman who was, working 2 jobs as an Uber driver and running a small coffee shop, and she's just driving, and what happens is not her, but her daughter makes some post that's like, critical of the police. And, the details aren't that important, but basically, she's working her second job as an Uber driver when she sees a notification. By the time she sees it, it's too late, and it's gone viral, and people are screaming at her on the internet, and, basically her coffee shop, its business has gone away because the police boycotted and other people aren't there. And so, that wasn't even her who said something. It was just somebody in her social network who said something. And it just killed this small coffee shop. And this woman was working 2 jobs, and that under, in my view, under no, model of the world is like a just punishment. And so the issue here is basically that one way of thinking about this is that negative press is an attack on your social network, and that can be, from the press or it can be from a Twitter feed. But let's say you've got this person over there. Let's say they're apolitical. They've got some apolitical friends. They've got others of different hues. And then what happens is, there's some article that comes out, okay, that says this guy is a bad person, all right? And this periodical is not read by everybody, but it's read by enough nodes in their social network that now those people are either no longer his friends over here or the tie is weaker, okay? Now, this is kind of funny looking, as a diagram, but this is exactly what happens when negative press happens. And nowadays, it doesn't even have to be like a credible, mainstream-ish institution. It can be just like a Twitter feed. So Turtle Boy, is actually what blew up that poor woman's coffee shop, right? So everybody is now a journalist and a public figure, and can just put stuff out there that'll just harm somebody's reputation, and it's very, very difficult to recover from that because once you've been shunned over here, then you don't have a platform, you can't speak to people, and so on, right? So basically, one of the most important things to think about is what periodicals do your friends read? Because those periodicals have power over you, since they can install software into the brains of your social network and make them, turn on you or whatever, right? Or they can also turn them for you, which is a positive version. Okay, so recognizing this as kind of the dynamic, there's an interesting quote by this guy John Ronson who wrote this whole book on social media or public shaming. One of the things he said was quite interesting to my eye, at least. He said, there's a journalist that he did a pile-on against, and he wrote over here. He was among the first people to alert social media because Gil always gave my television documentaries bad reviews, so I tended to keep a vigilant eye on things he could be got for. Okay? So the ideology is often just a smokescreen for kind of personal vendettas, and this is actually very similar to what used to go on in the Soviet Union and, the People's Republic of China. So there's this great, monograph, the practice of denunciation in Stalinist Russia. And so, denunciation is, defined for the purpose of this report as an unsolicited written communication from a citizen about the wrongdoing of another citizen. And others were written manipulatively to get the state to act on behalf of an individual's private agenda. This has a long pedigree in Russian history, right? So, now it's not quite the same as reporting somebody to secret police and getting them shot, but it's still pretty bad because they are losing their job, if not their life. So, in the USSR or PRC, you lost your life, liberty, and property when you're purged. In the USA, you aren't killed or jailed and don't lose your bank account, but you do lose your job and you're a pariah, and that's still pretty bad. So, the thing is that, when folks are actually interviewed at the other end of these things, it's not just that, they're yelled at online. There's real consequences for them. They're, like Ronson interviewed them, they're unemployed, broke, and just, confused and traumatized because, humans are social animals, and losing your social networks is a big deal. Okay, so this is a problem. It's, why would we want to solve this? Well, one very practical argument as to why you want to solve this is sometimes, yes, many of, the kinds of things that people are attacked for on the internet are just stupid things, and they would agree they're stupid. Maybe the punishment's disproportionate, but they're stupid things. But once in a while, there's actually something that seems stupid, but is actually smart. And this is the true but surprising idea. And ideas like that are the core of big new things. So I'll just give a few examples. One you've definitely heard of, heliocentrism, right? So Galileo, in 1633 Italy, not that long ago, it wasn't like 10,000 years ago, but like, more than 400 years ago, the Galileo affair for like on the order of 20 years was persecuted and, eventually died under house arrest because he was suspect of heresy. Now, had he not pushed the ball forward and taken that hit, taken one for the team, basically, that's the basis for GPS and satellite internet and space travel. Because of Galileo, in part, that's why you can tag your Instagram photos with, being at the coffee shop, right? So, literally this guy is like locked to death, in a room for death, so you can, tag your friends. So another example of this is actually one that's much, much more close in time, and really just 1978. Most people don't know that like capitalism, entrepreneurship was literally punishable by death in China and the USSR, especially in China until Deng Xiaoping's reforms. And there's this great article on this in Planet Money. You can Google this, a secret document that transformed China. But essentially, this happened in a bunch of different places, but these were guys who actually lived. Most of them got executed. So the farmers in a small Chinese village called Zhaogang gathered in a mud hut to sign a secret contract. They thought it might get them executed. Instead, it wound up transforming China's economy in ways that are still reverberating today, right? And so their idea was, hey, like the contract was so risky and such a big deal because it was created at the height of communism in China. Everyone worked on the village's collective farm. There was no personal property. So basically, people said, what about the teeth in my head? Do I own those? And no, your teeth belong to the collective. That was, the level that, communism had gotten to there. And so they came up with an idea. Rather than farm as a collective, each farm would get to farm its own plot of land. If a family grew a lot of food, that family could keep some of the harvest. Now, that's an obvious idea is, yes, you get to keep some of what you own. Your taxation rate is not 100%. You keep your teeth and maybe also keep some grain. And this is an old idea, but it was such a dangerous idea in communist China that the farmers had to gather in secret. They signed a private contract among themselves, and they hid it in the roof of a hut. And it basically said, hey, if one of us is executed or tortured for practicing capitalism, then the others will take care of our children. Literally at that level, like starting a company punishable by death, okay? So that was pretty brave of them, really brave. That's an example of an idea that was unpopular, really unpopular, but a really good idea because, I can give you 10,000 photos like this. There's certainly pollution in China and what have you, but it's become, a first world country in many ways. And extreme poverty has just absolutely plummeted in our lifetime from like more than 80% in a subsistence level to like less than 10%. That's a gigantic achievement. There's many issues with, the Chinese government. I'm not a fan of everything by any means, but, this is something that has been gotten right. Like the introduction of capitalism really did improve human welfare for hundreds of millions of people. It was a good idea that people risked death for that had high upside. And, a third example, again, very contemporaneous, is Bitcoin and its precursors. So one thing most people don't know is that all the previous creators of new currencies were jailed. So the guy who did the, Liberty Dollar, prison may be the next stop on a gold currency journey, Bernard von Nothaus, he's, there's a physical dollar, he got capped. And the Liberty Reserve guy, that guy was actually more of a real criminal, but he was jailed, right? This guy was really just like an old guy who was just selling some, gold coins. He didn't, to my knowledge, do anything wrong. But Satoshi managed to take this good idea, and he added a bunch of new developments. Obviously, he added, the Byzantine generals breakthrough, that is the Nakamoto consensus algorithm, and a bunch of other things. But one of his most important things that he did was he stayed pseudonymous long enough to let the idea stand for itself. He put this thing out on the internet, stayed pseudonymous, despite the attempts to unmask him, which were unsuccessful. He has stealthed all the way through, and now Bitcoin and the entire blockchain industry is at 170 billion market cap, and it's basically got kind of this freight train-like momentum. That's another example of such an unpopular but good idea that the precursors were literally thrown in jail, and he figured out a way around it, which was to go pseudonymous, go Satoshi, get the idea out there, and is now the world's first pseudonymous billionaire, but probably not our last. So those are three examples of really good ideas: heliocentrism, capitalism in China, and Bitcoin, that could have had, like house arrest or death or jail or worse. And so, some of these unpopular ideas are very good. So how do we open up the space to discuss them? And I'm not talking about just stupid insults that people get attacked for on social media. I'm talking about like good ideas that that people get attacked for. How do we open up space to discuss them? And I propose two solutions. The first is an individual solution, which I call maximizing your personal runway, and the second is a collective solution that complements that individual solution. Let's talk about the first one. So, everybody here is living in San Francisco, or probably is nearby. Actually, not everybody, but a lot. And the thing is that the single most important metric for an individual is your personal runway, right? That is your savings divided by your burn rate. I know it's an extremely anti-American concept, savings, but it can be measured, okay? And the thing that's very counterintuitive, or that people don't even talk about or think about, is that it's easier to cut the denominator by 5 to 10x than it is to increase the numerator by 5 to 10x, right? So if you've got, this is a fake bank account, don't worry, but that's, if you've got a bank account over here and you've got savings, yes, you can spend, burn, $4,000 a month in San Francisco, or you can work remote in Chiang Mai at $800 a month, $900 a month, and that's like basically 1/3 to 1/4 the cost, and therefore 3x to 4x the runway. If you have a job that allows you to work remote, that's really good because now you've got 4x the runway for the same amount of work. And the thing is, the rest of the world has gotten very livable, and so this is a simple deterministic recipe for financial independence. Okay, in 2005. Okay, come to Silicon Valley, found a company, raise VC. And in 2017, it's leave Silicon Valley, don't found a company, don't raise VC. You just need to be willing to move and live like a grad student. You don't need to be a founder or even a smart or lucky crypto investor. In a little more detail, basically, my advice to you would be get a remote work job at a big company, potentially, like a Google or a Facebook, or a stable startup like a GitHub or Airbnb. Be on site here if necessary for like a year to prove yourself, and then after a year, turn down the promotion. If you're actually promoted, then you have to be a manager, you have to be local, you're a hub. But if you're a spoke, you can be remote. So make yourself indispensable, and after a year, rather than getting promoted, say, I want to work, not to be promoted, but I want to be remote, right? Once you do that, now you can just cut your burn rate by 4, 5, 6x. Basically, skies or really floor's the limit. Save tons of money. And now you don't need angel funding, okay? Because basically, if you had a burn rate before, let's say your income is $120,000, and you go from a burn rate of like $80,000 or $90,000 a year to $20,000 a year, every year that you work, you're getting 3 or 4 years of runway. So you don't need angel funding anymore, right? You're now financially independent. Voila. So congratulations. And there's great tools like Nomad List and Teleport that will help you do this. And one of the biggest new things over the last 10, 15 years is the rest of the world, because capitalism has gone into China, it's gone to Vietnam, it's gone to all these places, they've become very livable, very nice places to live, especially if all you're doing is sitting in your room, coding all day. So check out Nomad List, check out Teleport. That's a company that I founded that got acquired recently. These will help you do these kind of compare and contrasts and really dig into where you actually want to live. And the thing about this is financial independence is personal independence. You should take some of that runway probably and put it into crypto. And once you're financially independent, you can choose to speak your mind without fear of economic consequences. So we downvoted you on social media, and you think this gives you power over me, right? So you're now invincible, right? So that's pretty cool. Okay, so let's talk about the second thing. So now this is something where this is a longer term thing. I'd say this is ripe to do right now, right? Right now you can go and you can move out of the U.S. and you can save 5, 10x. Okay, but the thing about this is it's kind of an individual lifestyle. It's something where yes, you can save money. It's a very good thing to do, but we also want to do something more collective, right? And this is a longer term project, and this is what we're working on. So a parallel economy. So let me just explain what we're doing at 21 and knit the pieces together. So we have this app at 21.co that lets you make money online. After Monday, by the way, it's going to be at earn.com, but just 21.co for now. So this lets you make money online, and basically it's like a news feed, except it's not distracting and it's not people yelling at you on Twitter, but you're actually making money, right? So reply to emails, complete tasks, click buttons, and make money. And so basically you do this, and it's a positive sum social network. Every single notification you're getting is something that's good. We've got this token launch coming out in December, where you can also earn for signing up and inviting friends at 20.co token. And so basically all the folks you invite also, give you some. So it's something where you're actually incentivized to invite your whole contact book. And it's basically like a token-based social network, which doesn't require an ICO, but it's something where the edges now have currency associated with them, and it allows you to earn digital currency rather than mining or buying it, and makes social networks actually useful, right? So how does this relate to our previous topic? Well, basically, if this works, then we can start building a parallel economy, where people aren't just liking and tweeting and poking at each other, but they're actually buying things from each other, buying time from each other in particular, because time is a really good digital good. You can buy, bug bounties or surveys or emails back and forth. And if this thing really works, then at closed loops that happen at scale, you start to get a parallel economy, right? Once you've got enough people in the network with enough different skills, you can have the equivalent of the butcher buying from the baker, buying from the candlestick maker. You start to build a whole parallel ecosystem. And because it's crypto, over time, users can earn pseudonymously, right? You can just swap out and start to go Satoshi. Now, if you've got pseudonymous nodes in this network, well, they're now immunized from those social network attacks, okay? Because they're earning pseudonymously. The Wall Street Journal or whatever says this person is now bad, but they can't connect this to this person, right? Like the underlying human isn't targeted. And so as such, your job doesn't go away. They've targeted a speaking name. Here's your earning name. They're two different things. Unless they can map them together, which is doxing and not that easy to do necessarily. Your earning name, your speaking name, your real name can all be distinct things. Now, to be absolutely clear, I recognize that's a journey of 1,000 miles. It's going to take a while to get there. But if you want to join us, go and try 21, and you can see what we've got today. So just in summary, speaking your mind today can have economic penalties. The crowd can gang up on you. As an individual solution, I propose that you can maximize your personal runway by working remote and moving overseas, cutting this denominator B by 5x or more. And as a group solution, help us build this parallel economy at 21, where eventually in 5 or 10 years, people can start earning pseudonymously and becoming more and more immune to social network attacks. Thank you.